Welcome and welcome back to the channel. So, how many of you have watched a series or read a book and afterwards thought to yourself, this is fun and all, but I wish the story did more with the ideas it had? This is literally me with Mermaid Melody Pichi Pichi Peach, a musical magical girl series from 2002 where the trade-off for its beautiful character designs and banging soundtrack is a veritable fountain of nonsensical melodrama and enough plot holes to make anyone with trypophobia cry. Now, I'm a huge sucker for magical girls, and I'm also a huge sucker for mermaids, so if you put the two together in a story, I'm probably going to enjoy it to a certain degree. But oh boy, do I have a lot of opinions and hot takes about this series. This video is all about me organizing those thoughts, which all come up from a place of love, about how I would personally approach an assignment to write a magical girl story about 7 mermaid princesses, by overanalyzing everything that stands out to me in the original canon and mining it for its potential, as part of my contribution to this year's Mermaid. For convenience, my analysis will be restricted to the original manga series that was published in the early 2000s. So we're not going to talk about the anime, because I've never watched it, or the sequel manga Mermaid Melody Aqua, because it's not finished yet. Either way, consider this your spoiler warning for the series. With that being said, let's start! So, the first major point I wanted to bring up for this analysis is that the main characters are supernatural beings, so let the story give them permission to be supernatural beings, dang it! Our heroines spend most of their time on land, disguised as humans, and are depicted as living the lives of ordinary teenagers. What sets Mermaid Melody apart from other magical girl series of its time is the fact that the protagonists aren't regular schoolgirls who obtain special powers and have the world around them shifted to a magical adventure beyond their typical mundane life. Instead, they already do have special powers by virtue of them coming from a race of fantasy creatures that exist in a place inaccessible to humans, so this world that's normal for our characters is already much different from our own. When taking this into consideration, I think it's a tragic missed opportunity that the story took the default position of having Lucia, Hanon, and Rina be depicted as ordinary middle school students, and to make things even worse, the scenes that we did get involving magic and the mermaid world aren't treated as special by the storytelling. I mean, when the princesses use their pearls to transform into their magical girl alter egos, they have human legs. The only villain from the first season who has a tail is 𝚖𝚊𝚒𝚒. Sarah and 𝚬𝚐, who are mermaid princesses, are more often than not seen with legs when they're in cahoots with Gokto and Laurent, even when they're underwater. And shoot, even the goddess of the seas herself, Aqua Regina, is never not depicted with human legs. What is going on here? I mentioned this before in another video, but it's actually a huge pet peeve of mine when a story is set in a fantasy world that's so light on the fantasy elements that the characters living in that world don't have anything special that sets them apart from regular humans, and I think Mermaid Melody is a prime example of this. Personally, and this opinion will be the basis for all my other ideas going forward, I think a better choice would be to go all the way and have the main setting actually be underwater and have Lucia, Hanon, and Rina predominantly be in their mermaid forms. Not to say they should never go on land, because I think the canon story actually makes for a really cool linear progression for the journey the characters go on, where they start out under the sea, then as they make progress in their journey, they travel up to the surface where the situation escalates to a point where they have to go on land, and they go even further up when the second arc begins and these winged villains make their appearance. However, I do lament how little focus was given to mermaid lore, and even the world building that we did get is riddled with inconsistencies. Just to name a few, Hippo's broken pearl radar that can easily be written out with very little if any changes to the plot, and a mermaid turning into sea foam if she reveals herself to a human, which seems to be completely irrelevant in the relationship between Taro and Sarah. This isn't me claiming that I think Mermaid Melody should be Lord of the Rings 2.0, and I understand that on top of the requisite tasks of visual design, character development, writing, and storytelling, taking on the additional effort of world building for unique fantasy lore is not easy. So I can appreciate the desire to go for the path of least resistance by having the main cast get into situations that aren't too different from what teenagers in the real world would get up to, but it's reasonable to want to see the characters do more and mean more that's specific to them being mermaids, other than siren songs of death and being zooted off Coca-Cola. On top of that, having Mermaid Melody's setting primarily be in an undersea world that only exists beyond the audience's wildest dreams would help make the series more competitive against other stories in its genre, both as a magical girl manga where teenage schoolgirl romance is the norm, and also as a piece of mermaid fiction where adaptations of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale are overwhelmingly represented. So, what are some ways the story's world building could have been handled? Well, I do have a few ideas. First of all, the power system is built upon music and singing, and the mermaid princesses all follow a rainbow theme, so making a reference to Isaac Newton pairing each color of the rainbow with a note on the C major scale was literally right there in front of the creators, and they didn't tie that in with the girls' magic whatsoever. In the words of our good friend Wikipedia, Isaac Newton had associated the 7 solfege symbols with the 7 colors of the rainbow and surmised that each color vibrated accordingly, a concept possibly related to the modern view of chromesthesia. Each note and color is conveniently matched up with each other in their respective orders on the scale and the sequence in which the 7 colors of the rainbow appear. So red is C/Do, orange is D/Re, yellow is E/Me, and so on, with red, the C note, having the least amount of vibration, and the B note, purple, having the most vibration. Each girl's song could have a different frequency that has an impact on the output of their powers. It's reasonable to assume that Lucia, the pink mermaid princess, is meant to occupy what would be the red part of the rainbow, and the C note's lack of vibration either could or could not be connected to why she's a bad singer. Continuing with the topic of singing magic, I think the Japanese belief of kotonama would be a perfect fit for this universe. When this concept first came to me, I went down a tangent of all the different ways I thought it could play out in the context of Mermaid Melody. The idea of sound magically affecting objects could be combined with the mermaid songs. It ties into Rina working at a shrine that venerates mermaids, and the tradition said shrine has about carving the names of yourself and your loved one into a candle to preserve their love, and thus gives the girls a stronger connection to the human world and another reason to protect it other than the fact that their love interests live there. Plus, sound travels faster at water and reaches both ears at almost the same time, so how does that affect the mermaid singing abilities on the sea compared to in the water? And it could even be part of the reason why mermaids can't reveal themselves. Instead of being turned into foam, the consequences involve the mermaid leaving themselves open to that person having power over her now that they have access to her real name and identity. Honestly, I think this makes a lot more sense than actual canon, which right away I take issue with, as the way the sea foam thing is written feels like an excuse to facilitate a will they won't they dynamic with Lucia, Hanon, Rina, and their love interests, and even then there's constant loopholes being exploited, so they end up not facing any consequences. I get that having a mermaid turn into foam is an intentional reference to the Little Mermaid source material, but in the context of the story, it feels like giving up too much ground. This is a shoujo romance manga with elementary school age girls as its key demographic. If the main character is doomed to die because the intended love interest is a human, then of course she's going to beat the odds and live happily ever after in the end. So any hope the creators had of setting up dramatic tension with this dilemma has been built on the sand. With this other idea, it still creates high stakes without requiring a character to die, and it fits with the recurring theme of the villain stealing other people's powers. My next point in this category of expanding details that were introduced in the original manga, there was a good deal of focus placed on what day of the week the mermaids were born on, mostly to tie that in with a fortune-telling personality quiz, but I thought it would be interesting to take that concept a step further, since there are actually different gemstones assigned for the days of the week, 2 stones for each day, 14 in total, that our magical girls could draw their powers from. Now obviously, if you're going to associate any gemstone with a mermaid, then a pearl would be the logical association, so there isn't any point in messing around with that. This is true, but when looking at early concept art from the manga, it's pretty clear that the shell-shaped pearl pendants weren't an idea the creators had from the beginning, so I think they just chose it out of convenience. Plus, there are already plenty of instances where the undersea characters have accessories that belong on land. The ceremonial dresses the girls wear in their mermaid forms are decorated with flowers, and Gakto inexplicably uses rose magic and wears a fur-lined coat despite being sealed away in the bottom of the sea. There's a specific mental image I have of these gemstones growing in reefs around the princess's castles like coral, which is another way to add an extra dose of whimsy to this fantasy story. Anyway, I still wanted to have fun with this concept and think about how each mermaid princess being represented by a different gemstone could help make them and their countries feel more distinct, especially since each gemstone has its own unique metaphysical properties attributed to it that could tie into their powers. The fact that there's 2 gemstones per day of the week could tie into the princesses upgrading to their super idol forms. For example, Lucia starts out with a pearl, which is the day of the week gemstone for Monday, but as the series progresses and she gets a higher level of transformation, she draws powers from both a pearl and a quartz. By the way, does anybody else get reminded of the Solomon Grundy nursery rhyme whenever it's mentioned that Lucia was born on a Monday, or is that just me?
Solomon Grundy want pants too!
I know I've already ranted a decent amount about this story's shortcomings. Don't worry, there's plenty more where that came from later on in the video. But I feel like now is the time to mention some aspects about the original story that I really like and shouldn't be lost in a revamped premise. This may be a controversial opinion, but I think one of the unique elements about Mermaid Melody that helped it stand out compared to other magical girl series is that our heroines don't use weapons or physical violence in order to resolve conflicts with the antagonist. Make no mistake, I love me some precure CQC, and turning foes into friends with laser cannon facilitated character development, but if Mermaid Melody doesn't need any of that, then that's fine. In theory, I feel like this approach does a really good job of conveying the story's central message of how true power comes from unity and teamwork. Another detail I appreciate is that the mermaid's main quest doesn't involve them looking for an all-powerful artifact that'll make them stronger, but it's instead about uniting all of the 7 princesses so they'll be able to summon Aqua Regina. Having a story like this, where the MacGuffin isn't a physical object, but rather the act of uniting this team of magical girls, conveys a really beautiful message about the power of friendship, especially since all the main villains are characterized by loneliness of different kinds. Gakto's loneliness turns into jealousy, Sarah's emotional loneliness turns into despair and vengefulness, Mikaru's social loneliness turns into codependency, and Mikeru's existential loneliness turns into shame and narcissistic injury. And basically him repeating the 5 stages of grief all at once. On that note, it's interesting to see how all of these villains react a different way to the main characters in response to the unique expressions of their suffering. Gakto tries to play on the sympathy of Lucia, Hanon, and Rina, and when he encounters Kaito before the final battle, he uses the fact that they're brothers as leverage. Sarah basically turns into a nihilist. Mikaru is extremely possessive of Kaito and wants him to prioritize her above everyone else because that's also what she did to him. And Mikeru calls out the mermaids for being falsely elevated into their status because they were born princesses. Another part of the story that I think is really cool are those little scenes we get of the mermaids gathering together, discussing how to find other mermaids after the communication between their countries broke down, investigating the key to the Steel Gate, and rebuilding their kingdoms. Seriously, this makes me want a magical girl tactical RPG. Somebody make it happen! Unfortunately, these scenes of the main characters engaging in any kind of diplomatic procedures about what's going on in the mermaid world are very few and far between, which brings me to my long list of plot and character details that got fumbled in canon or are otherwise just plain confusing. Buckle up everyone, this is going to be a bumpy ride. Continuing the thread I already picked up with the world building, when you take into account how little time we spend in the undersea world with the characters, it's kind of amazing that canon gave us as much information as it did, but even then it wasn't a lot and there's still no small amount of unsolved mysteries. One huge reason why there are so many unknowns in the first place, other than lazy writing, is that we don't have context for what is considered normal in the world or what is just a situational occurrence. This mostly has to do with the circumstances around 𝚬𝚐's birth. Is 𝚬𝚐's manner of coming into the world, where the energy from the life of the mermaid's ocean collects in a pool as a glowing orb, which is the fragment of her heart containing the love, friendship, and power to believe that every young girl needs, minus the fragments of her hearts being stolen by Mikeru, which the glowing orbs were able to sense, a normal part of mermaid princess succession, or even mermaid reproduction as a whole? Or is this an anomaly because of Sarah's non-conventional exit and her and Gakto nurturing this new life after the two of them have been sealed away into a deep sleep? Based on the Super Love Song short story, which goes into Lucia's backstory and how she and Kaito first met, it's reasonable to believe that mermaids are spawned from some sort of ceremonial pool, but is this common for all mermaids or just princesses? The mermaids sing a prayer as a wish for Sarah's rebirth and take heed knowing they'll meet her again someday. So are mermaid princesses supposed to be reborn once they're no longer a part of this world? Are mermaid princesses like Time Lords or the Avatar? Then again, Aqua Regina also says that this will be until they meet a princess of the Indian Sea again, so is 𝚬𝚐 not supposed to be part of this equation after all? If so, what was supposed to happen between Gakto and Sarah that got thrown out when the 𝚬𝚐 plot needed to happen? Hypothetically, what if Sarah was part mermaid princess and part Panthalassa and was supposed to represent a union between Panthalassa and the mermaid princesses who were once opposed to one another? If there could be a mermaid goddess who formed a union with a human and that's how Awami's shrine came to be, why not this? The legend between Awami's shrine states that the god of romantic fate tells the mermaid and the shipwrecked man to carve each other's names into a candle, and the two will feel the same love for each other as long as the flame continues to burn.
I have loved your love more than anyone could love eternal love like this love.
Are there other deities tied to the mermaid world besides Aqua Regina? Even the mermaid from the legend was stated to be a goddess. Going back to Super Love Song, is it normal for mermaids to become ill after so many battles? Is this supposed to be a statement that the mermaid princess's power was meant for preserving peace and not for fighting, so defeating Gakto and Mikuru were responsibilities they were never meant to handle? What is the purpose of the new moon ceremony for mermaids who have already turned 13? Did Lucia have one off screen after her birthday? Hippo says outright that Lucia's celebration for her 13th birthday, which had been put on hold for 7 months, can now commence since she found her pearl again. How necessary is the pearl in other ceremonial occasions like this? Are there different pearl rituals that a princess is obligated to attend compared to a regular mermaid? Also, what other responsibilities and freedoms does a mermaid have when she reaches the age of majority at 13, apart from the restrictions against romance? That last part is pretty poorly explained since mermaids still can't fall in love with humans. During the preparation, Taki gives to Nikora and the other mermaids who are about to embark on the new moon ceremony is the warning Taki gave about bringing unhappiness to the entire country of the mermaid who was seen by a human a rewarding of not being allowed to fall in love with humans, or is that an additional risk? Lucia believes Taki is bluffing when she gives said warning, so who's correct here? Considering Taki apparently told Lucia when she asked about humans that they don't exist, it doesn't seem like Taki has a good track record for honesty. Is she the one who gives the warning to mermaids about turning to foam, or does that come directly from Aqua Regina? Is that also untrue? Is Taki's role just limited to the country of the North Pacific, or are her services needed in the other mermaid kingdoms? Are there other people in her role for the other kingdoms, or is she just like the Nurse Joy of mermaid fortune tellers? Considering the treasure of aquamarine mermaids is the music box of the pale moon, what significance does the moon play in mermaid lore aside from the obvious effects the moon has on changing the tides? Do the other 7 kingdoms have treasures associated with them other than the aquamarine mermaid's music box? Is not being able to fall in love with humans really the worst thing mermaid princesses have to deal with? How often do mermaids have contact with humans in order for this to be a thing? Is the outcome of them turning into foam supposed to be a punishment from Aqua Regina, or just a natural consequence of their actions? Obviously, the story's main cast primarily consists of princes and princesses, but what about the other fantasy occupations in a royalty setting? For example, knight, master of ceremonies, gardener, explorer, spy, miner, sculptor, dressmaker, lady's maid, doctor, jeweler, and tutor, just to name a few. Since music is such an important part of the plot, it'd be really interesting to see merfolk versions of bards, musicians, and even jesters. Another idea worth exploring is to have each mermaid princess's song incorporate elements from traditional music of the countries that are in the same region of the seas they preside over. Getting back to the topic, in early development material, the character we now know as Kaito was originally going to be a pirate captain. So what if the Panthalassa clan was associated with acts of piracy? What is life like for the lay people living in these mermaid countries? Are there any other mythological undersea creatures aside from mermaids, Suio, and whatever the Panthalassa clan is? Aqua introduced sirens and non-female merfolk into the plot, but there are so many other kinds of merfolk worth playing around with as part of a cast of ensemble or incidental characters, like 𝚖𝚒𝚒𝚎, Selkies, Kelpies, Finfolk, and Buka. Personally, I really like the idea of Gakto being a Buka, but that's just me. Also, I hope I'm pronouncing that word correctly. The Dark Lovers and Black Beauty Sisters were originally sea creatures given humanoid forms with Gakto's magic. So, are there any other creatures in the deep sea who are like this? Is the reason why the Suio are so obsessed with Gakto part of some spell that makes them completely loyal and devoted to the one who cast this transformation spell on them? With all the importance placed on the main characters for being princesses, who's the queen of their respective kingdoms that they're presumably heirs to? I'm guessing Aqua Regina, which doesn't make any sense at all. There needs to be a ruling body over the mermaid countries that the princesses are heir apparent to, who actually have a physical presence that doesn't require the communion of all 7 princesses in order to manifest. That just spells out doom for your monarchy. Mermaid Melody is also fond of concepts like fate and destiny, but those words tend to just get thrown around a lot without it really meaning anything. The biggest examples are the fact that mermaids aren't allowed to love humans, and the heroines feel oppressed by this fate, while Kaito has been entrusted with the destiny of Panthalassa, which he rejects because he's Kaito and no one else. This is possibly influenced by the letter his parents wrote him when they assure him not to let the weight of his destiny get him down because they know he'll come through it shining. Although thinking about it now, this kind of makes the resolution of Pure feel like a contradiction of this theme. I mentioned Aqua Regina a lot in passing already, so let's shift the topic over to characters and put her in the hot seat for a minute. If praying to her during the coming of age ceremony is still necessary, and if she's still able to protect Lucia's kingdom and give the girls transformation upgrades and new melodies even after she had used up her power sealing away Gakto, what is the impact of her not being around other than giving the main characters a goal in their magical girl quest? What changes after she's summoned again? Although I can appreciate the writers having the good sense to know that if the mermaids were together during all of their battles, it would suck the drama out of them since Aqua Regina would be summoned and neutralize the threat with no effort. What if Aqua Regina wasn't a goddess who could manifest as a separate physical entity, but something that all 7 mermaid princesses could fuse into once they were united? Which is extremely Voltron coded, I understand. It would work as a parallel to Gakto's Mirages and how this enforces the bond of friendship the girls have now that they're a full ensemble creating one song together. As for how this plot device of all 7 princesses being together from the start ties in with the second arc, the scene in which Mikiru takes 𝚬𝚐 into her body after becoming one with Mikaru is reinterpreted as 𝚬𝚐 sacrificing herself in an attack by undoing the Aqua Regina fusion, so Mikiru can't claim all of their power at once, and 𝚬𝚐 still learns about sadness and empathizing with Mikiru's loneliness during her capture. What happened to the old Aqua Regina after she chose Lucia as her successor? What made her choose Lucia to take her place other than main character syndrome? Is it because she worked together with the 7 mermaid princesses as opposed to each princess doing their duties with their own kingdoms? Is being Aqua Regina like being the Pope? It's implied that Aqua Regina can see in the past and the future, so is this an ability that Lucia has after being given this responsibility? If so, then Aqua Regina's ineffectuality makes even less sense. For example, near the end of Super Love Song, Aqua Regina says that the Steel Gate has been undone and set Gakto free. Even though she's also alluding to Mikiru in this statement, she's addressing Gakto's release in the past tense as if it had just happened. And considering Sarah was the one who freed Gakto, it shouldn't have been possible for her to do this considering the accident that Lucia saved Kaito from was caused by Sarah and her despair over not seeing Taro. Was this a translation error, or was it actually written that way in the original Japanese text? And if this wasn't a plot hole and Aqua Regina was just seeing time laid out in front of her, then what was stopping her from preventing any of this? What exactly is Lucia's fate of nobility and suffering apart from her role as Aqua Regina, since those seem to be treated as 2 separate things? One last note about Super Love Song, Lucia tells Aqua Regina that it was Aqua Regina who gave Lucia the strength to keep living until she found her pearl again. So does this imply that Lucia would have died after giving her pearl to Kaito? By that logic, Karen, Noelle, and Coco should have been unalive too, since Karen threw her pearl at the Black Beauty sisters to save the main trio before Gakto kidnapped her, and not only did Gakto remove Noelle and Coco's pearls and put them in a crown thingy, but the Black Beauty sisters also stole the pearls and used them to track down and attack Lucia. There are some points for the rest of the cast that I want to make, but there's one huge part of the story that really bothers me that I need to talk about before anything else, and it ties back into my earlier plot point about why I think it was a mistake to have this mermaid story mostly take place on land instead of in the water. Considering the princesses have the power to control the sea, when the girls left, they took the safety of their kingdoms with them, so it really feels like the people of their countries got left to fend for themselves while the main crew just kind of dipped. Now, I get that Gakto is after the princess's pearls and that's why our main trio fled to the human world, but is it just a given that the other princesses who haven't been captured made their way to land and that's the only way the main trio can find them? As if that wasn't bad enough, all of the main characters are so dang passive! Even in the context of a magical girl series where it's the norm to see a balance between our heroines fighting evil by moonlight and winning love by daylight, each chapter of Mermaid Melody is centered around boilerplate slice of life romance scenes, and the plot progression stuff kind of just happens to fall into the characters' laps without them doing anything proactive to earn any kind of payoff for these turning points in the story. Fate at the 7 seas and the world is at stake, and they're just killing time, going on trips, flirting with boys. It's really frustrating and honestly boring.
I love her lack of energy. Go girl, give us nothing.
Adding to the disappointment, because several of the main characters already set a precedent for wanting to take action against the villains, such as Lucia being fired up to keep the promise she made to Aqua Regina and make the villains pay for what they're doing to the seas, which is refreshing to see amidst so many other reluctant heroine magical girl protagonists. Rina being one of the girls who has the strongest motivation, and she clearly has the most information about the villains and the impact their actions are having on the world around them. And she obviously carries a lot of guilt about Noelle being captured, even before discovering that she and Karen are twins. Considering Rina and Noelle were talking about how their next course of action was to find the other princesses after Rina's country got taken down, there was potential for the two of them to have been developing a plan on how to accomplish this before Noelle was kidnapped. And after Rina joins the team with Lucia and Hanon, Rina tries to pick up the pieces of what was left behind in her plan with Noelle now that these two other mermaids are on her side. But unfortunately, the characters are just being pushed around by the story like discs on a shuffleboard. Okay, I got that out of my system. So let's talk about the rest of the main characters, starting with Lucia. Right off the bat, Lucia had the potential to be a more nuanced character if her operating a famous business with Nikora and her talent for baking and handcrafting was given more focus. Which makes the scene where she's opening up to Kaito after he won the surf meet despite his injury and is wondering what she should do when she can't do everything well like he can, and Kaito being sure that Lucia was believing in him when he wasn't sure if he would, make it even more touching. And that's about the extent of all the good things I had to say about Lucia, because when you really stop and think about all the things she did and said in canon, man, is she problematic. Of course, I know that narratively, it's not a bad thing to have your main character be a flawed individual, but it's important to keep in mind whether or not you want them to mature out of those flaws as the story progresses, or if the character is supposed to be a role model. And neither of these are looking good for Lucia, since she's extremely obsessive towards Kaito, and during the harder times in their relationship, she actually becomes pretty toxic. During the final battle of the first arc, Lucia's dilemma over wanting to save Kaito, but also not wanting to give up her pearl feels a little contrived given the fact that 𝚬𝚐 exists later on. So it feels like the worst that could happen to her is either she sacrifices herself and she's the one who has to be reborn instead of the orange princess, or Gakto takes her pearl and allows her to live in her own misery as part of his collection. She is initially willing to submit and hand over her pearl just to keep Kaito alive, which I definitely have issue with. Do the lives of the Seven Seas and her fellow princesses really take a back seat to some boy that she only met once 7 years ago and since then only known for like 17 months? Does she really think that this is the best she can do? Not that it matters because Hanon conveniently jumps in with Hippo's key rod before it's too late, so anyway. Then later on in the second arc, Lucia almost falls down the crumbling staircase in Mikuru's castle while Kaito holds her hand, and she tells him to go on without her because she can't be saved and she can't do anything without the others anyway, which was definitely written in to heighten the drama, but it just makes Lucia come across as even more selfish, because if she were to die, then Aqua Regina wouldn't be able to be summoned even if 𝚬𝚐 was born, and she knows this. On top of the main issue I have about Lucia's relationship involving her being way too obsessive over Kaito, she seems incredibly selfish and immature during the second arc. She tells Kaito that she didn't want to share him with anyone during his birthday when he's answering the phone call from Rihito. She worries that Kaito's emotions for her will transfer to someone else, which is a highly irrational and unrealistic look, and she even tells 𝚬𝚐 that this is something she's worried about for a long time. What kind of lessons are we teaching 𝚬𝚐 about love through Lucia's obsessive attachment style with Kaito? Is this why 𝚬𝚐 became so manipulative in Aqua? To be fair, Lucia kind of learns a lesson here and acknowledges that 𝚬𝚐 is right when she disagrees with Lucia's anxieties, but she gets really toxic in the scene after 𝚬𝚐 and Mikaru are taken by Mikuru by saying that Kaito should have handled the situation of his guilt about Mikaru the way 𝚬𝚐 handled being kidnapped, and then when Kaito tries to tell her that people aren't as strong as they think they are, which carries some extra weight since the final song the mermaids sing to Mikuru and Mikaru include the lyric of the world not being made for the strong alone, and that he felt the same unbearable loneliness that Mikaru did. Lucia takes this personally when she says that she thought Kaito had her and calling Kaito awful for believing that she doesn't mean anything to him because he still feels lonely, and then runs off before he can say anything. Seriously, Lucia has all of her princess friends and a kingdom to return to that's being protected by Aqua Regina and populated by other mermaids, but Kaito has no such anchor, even saying later on after the final battle that Mikaru has a home to return to, implying that she has something he lacks. So she just seems especially manipulative, attention-seeking, unsympathetic, and egocentric, and she's now called out for her behavior. Speaking of which, the fact that Lucia has no choice but to lie and say no during the scene in the second arc when Rihito asks her if she knew anything about Mikaru's feathers would definitely raise a lot of interesting questions from him upon learning her true identity and realizing she was deceptive toward him about this incredibly serious moment concerning his only surviving family member that he's extremely protective of, especially considering the last interaction Rihito had with Mikaru when she was having her breakdown and she invalidated his expression of love for her and she claimed the only person who loved her was their father, who is the person Rihito hates the most. While I do believe Lucia's white lie was justified, I don't think Rihito would be too happy in the slightest to find out that what Lucia said to him wasn't honest. One more note about Lucia, it was always super weird to me how at the time of Lucia's birth, Takia says that she had never seen such shiny nobility nor deep darkness of suffering as she saw in Lucia's Pearl, when arguably both orange princesses suffered the most. I guess now is the part where I talk about Hanon and Rina, but honestly they're my favorite of the mermaids, so I don't have a lot of notes about them specifically. Instead, I want to use this opportunity to talk about their relationships with their intended love interests, because I think Masahiro is really bland, and if Nagisa has zero haters, then I'm no longer alive. I never liked Nagisa as a character, or his relationship with Hanon for that matter, and the more I read the story, the more I dislike him. He constantly stalks and annoys Hanon, refuses to take no for an answer, and menaces the people who are close to her, usually men, and we as the audience are supposed to believe that they're a quirky, opposite-attract kind of couple. Considering Nagisa tried to impress Hanon by playing Taro's music and how he outright mentioned that he thought Taro was amazing, unlike him, I think I've come up with a better way to make Nagisa a flawed but endearing character whose romantic arc is a lot less toxic. When Hanon and Nagisa meet, their first impressions of each other are initially positive. But then things take a turn when during one conversation, Nagisa starts insulting Taro and his career, and Hanon doesn't like it one bit. As it turns out, Nagisa is also an aspiring pianist, but he has a huge ego and misplaced confidence in his own abilities, which informs his lack of respect for Taro. This creates an interesting dynamic between him and Hanon where the two of them get along really well as long as Taro isn't part of the conversation, and Hanon takes it upon herself to fight for the man she loves by administering music lessons to Nagisa with the purpose of humbling him. To make things even more complicated, Nagisa's opinion of Taro is inconsistent and hypocritical, so sometimes he expresses contempt for him, while other times he seems to respect him. And it turns out that Taro was a big role model for Nagisa when he was younger and wanted to grow up to be just like him. Nagisa's life was directionless at first, but after the news broke about the shipwreck that claimed the lives of Kaito's parents, this earth-shattering event is the wake-up call Nagisa needs to do something with his life. And he ultimately views Taro as an accessible mentor figure whom he sought to emulate, despite the two of them never having met. Unfortunately, Nagisa is unable to attract any sort of success for his musical contributions in his community, which frustrates him because he feels like he's just as good as Taro at a much younger age, and he grows to resent Taro's successes because they remind him of his own failures. Hanon feels more compassion towards Nagisa after learning this about him, and Nagisa learns to become a better person, which gradually culminates in the two of them falling in love. Come to think of it, I do have one note about Hanon specifically, which has to do with how much I dislike the scene with her and Taro's sheet music at the airport, primarily because she uses Taro's song later on to defeat Lady Bad, which makes me feel like this undermines the fact that these new melodies are granted to the girls by Aqua Regina. As for Rina, I'm of the persuasion that she doesn't need a romantic partner. Now, this isn't meant to feed into the lie that being strong and falling in love are mutually exclusive. Absolutely not. I'm just saying that for Rina specifically, she is, in my opinion, better suited for strong and supportive friendships that don't have a romantic connection. Even if she did fall in love, I think her expression of that love could be handled a lot better than in canon, because I think having her be all goofy and flustered is out of character for her. Of course, it's compelling to see characters in a situation they're not familiar or good with, because seeing them handling something that isn't a strength of theirs is more interesting to see and a better showcasing of character development than characters who are good at everything. Especially the character in question is more stoic and self-controlled, but the audience has no reason to believe that Rina's flustered attitude is a normal part of her personality that she tries to hide before she falls in love, so it really comes out of nowhere. It feels like a complete mismatch. With all that being said, I do have some ideas about what kind of bond she could have with Masahiro, which ties into the fact that he's descended from the man who's part of the Awami Shrine legend and believes he's part of a union between that man and the mermaid who saved him. As I said before, my idea for a rewrite of Mermaid Melody involves the story primarily taking place underwater as the mermaids go on a journey to stop Gakto, but then as the story progresses and the stakes start getting higher, it becomes necessary for Lucia, Hanon, and Rina to go to the surface, and they take asylum at Awami Shrine since it venerates mermaids. Just as an aside, aside, I feel like this would also justify the mermaids working jobs on land like they do at the pearl baths and the beach shop. The resources they gain from that work experience could be sent to the people of the undersea countries who lost or can't easily replenish those resources after being attacked by 𝚤𝚤. Anyway, in this version of events, Masahiro works at the shrine, and after running into each other a couple of times, he and Rina get to know each other and become friends, with Rina developing a great deal of appreciation for him as his dedication to the shrine is helping provide stability for her and her friends during this chaotic period they're in. Masahiro was also able to figure out on his own that Rina is a mermaid, and he chooses to keep this information to himself without tipping his hand to Rina, because he believes if she wanted him to know, she would have told him and wants to respect her boundaries. Bringing up Karen next, she says that from birth, she and Noelle have shared the same fate. What exactly is this fate, apart from them being born on opposite ends of the world and being mirrors of each other? That's another potentially interesting piece of Mermaid Country specific lore that we were robbed of. Also, Medea states that 𝚤𝚤 has brought all the people from Karen's country to his castle, but we see nothing about that whatsoever. Not in how this affects the villains, the country of the Antarctic Sea as a whole, or even Karen specifically. And the only reason this plot point was brought up seems to be so there could be a reason for the Dark Lovers to form an armistice amongst themselves, because they're worried that this change will cause 𝚤𝚤's heart to be lost to them forever if they don't do something about it. There was potential to be part of a really interesting character building moment for Karen, where she's forced to do two equally bad things, either let her sister remain kidnapped or go off to rescue her while leaving her country behind without their protector as a result, and show how she has to make this really difficult decision based on what she believes is the best thing to do according to her morals, while knowing full well that there will be serious consequences no matter what she does. Come to think of it, this whole thing about the Antarctic Sea is even dumber, because earlier in the very same chapter that this is brought up in, Rina was just remarking about how almost too quiet the sea has been lately, and how it feels as if the 𝚢𝚘𝚎 didn't even exist. I'm sorry, how is mass deporting the inhabitants of an entire country calm in any sense of the word? Please explain! Unfortunately, I don't have any notes about Noelle specifically, but I do have a few things to say about Coco, so let's talk about her for a bit. So during the climax of the first arc, Sarah tells Coco that she did nothing when Sarah was at her lowest point in life, and Coco herself admitted this was true. Coco came from the South Pacific to the Indian Ocean to check on Sarah because she was worried about her, and these two oceans are basically on the opposite sides of Australia, so that's pretty impressive. When Sarah realized what happened to her country, she ran away, which is where she found the 𝚢𝚎𝚒. So as the scene is presented in the story, it seems like Coco was doing everything she could to be there for Sarah. Maybe this is a scene of Coco actively trying to help Sarah and say something to express her concerns for her and make her feel better, but despite her good intentions, she misses the mark because she doesn't know what Sarah is going through right now after dealing with heartbreak, wishing she wasn't a princess, and realizing she destroyed her country, so her help actually ended up being more hurtful and unintentionally toxic, and now Coco is trying to make things right. Sarah also starts to become redeemed after she realized that 𝚤𝚤 never forgot about her, so adding the fact that Coco had always cared about her too to that revelation would make that scene even better. At first she didn't want to hear 𝚤𝚤's excuses or Coco's platitudes, but 𝚤𝚤 didn't come to Sarah because she was a princess, making her wonder if he did it for her country, if Coco did it because she was Sarah's friend, and if everyone was trying to do what was best for their princess and Sarah was the only one who didn't understand. Again, we spend most of our time with the mermaids while they're on land, so we don't know what they go through as mermaids, and as a result, we don't really get any sense of what Sarah's life was like before she met 𝚤𝚤 and how losing him impacted her now that she has to return to this life she didn't want without her lover with her anymore, despite her acknowledging that she was quite possibly the one of the two who was the most afraid of the love between a mermaid and a human. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about Coco, so let's end off the list of mermaids with Sarah. This analysis will also include my thoughts about 𝚤𝚤. How does Sarah benefit from 𝚤𝚤 obtaining all of the pearls? At one point, Sarah even laughs at 𝚤𝚤 and wonders if things will go as smoothly for 𝚤𝚤 as he thinks they will. However, later on she still tells 𝚤𝚤 that she wants him to fill the world with the dark sea as soon as possible, then goes to the surface on a whim and stops the Black Beauty Sisters' attack on the mermaids during 𝚤𝚤's concert, and the story implies that her leaving the key to the 𝚢𝚎𝚒 behind was something she planted intentionally and wasn't a case of her dropping it by accident. So this almost seems to indicate that she's not on anyone's side and is just being a chaotic neutral trickster entity. That's how I interpret it anyway. Is this the result of unstructured writing? Yes. Definitely. Absolutely. But I think there's something worth diving into about a character who isn't evil just because they're not on the same side as the heroes and being entirely self-serving in their goals and not loyal to anyone. With that in mind, I think she and Gakto still end up having an evil love affair with each other, but they're working towards their own goals that are similar enough for them to interact with each other on a frequent basis. Then again, this would probably undermine the whole scene with Gakto being wrecked because of his all-consuming desire to fulfill his promise to Sarah, which, even in the story, comes out of nowhere. The only reason Gakto made his promise to her is because she wanted to be alone, because she felt like she was a useless princess and slapped him, so he just wanted to see her happy because she wasn't acting like herself? What is it she wants him to do for her? An interesting lens that I think is worth exploring with Sarah is the idea of her feeling nothing towards Taro anymore. Instead, Taro was the one who helped the main characters learn about Sarah. Then once everyone learns that the Orange Princess, Sarah, has been corrupted, they can see how apathetic she is towards Taro to the point where she won't even give him the dignity of being captured by her. And instead, the mermaids are fulfilling a promise to Taro to find Sarah again by reuniting the 7 princesses and help her to warm her heart again. As much as I would love to see Sarah still be a part of the story now that she's fully redeemed, this would be pretty hard to do given how 𝚬𝚐 is the chief cornerstone of Pure. But the compromise I was able to come up with involves 𝚬𝚐 atoning for her crimes after the final battle, which she does by using her magic to restore the country of the Indian Sea back to its former glory, and the toll this takes on her body that's already been seriously wounded after protecting someone else from being crushed by falling debris in Gakto's castle is what leads to her demise. Considering Sarah's ghost was able to first contact Lucia inside her dreams, tell her about her successor and warn her about Mikiru, and later on 𝚬𝚐 uses the dream corridor to get Lucia, Hanon, and Rina away from Mikiru, is this a domain only orange mermaids have power over? If so, could this explain how Gakto was able to appear in Kaito's dreams, like Sarah's magic allowed him to do so? What other specific magical domains could the princesses possibly have? For Taro, it would have been cool to see what his backstory was like before he met Sarah, what was going on in his life that made him give up on music, and how his relationship with Sarah helped bring him out of that, which would have made the tragedy of their separation hit even harder. I do believe that Taro should have made a mistake that resulted in the dissolving of his relationship before it to actually play out differently than in canon, because in the actual manga it was really Baya's fault since she was actively trying to keep the two of them apart, since Sarah's loneliness is fueled by feelings of betrayal and trust issues. What were Taro's reasons for leaving Sarah other than him just doing what Baya told him to do even though he wanted to elope with Sarah before Baya found out and stepped in? Also, Taro mentioned that he was a music major in college when he first heard Kaito's parents' music, but lost his confidence and went off on a journey, then wants to make his own music and get to the bottom of whatever talent that he may have, through a song dedicated to Sarah, whom he met on said journey. So there's definitely room for there to be I spent all this money on tuition to get a degree and I don't even know if it's what I want struggle with him and his backstory that Sarah could help pull him out of. I do feel like it's possible that Taro inadvertently taught Sarah about a different kind of love that she only became consciously aware of after meeting Gakto, like she had a more immature kind of love before when she was with Taro that became something more concrete when she and Gakto became a thing, which could be what the lyric at the very end of the first arc about questioning the meaning of love in the midst of battle could be a reference to. I've also been considering what possibilities could exist if he was still a regular character in the second arc and see how he's been affected by Sarah's death. With Hippo, ignoring the whole mess about what his normal form is really supposed to be, is he a penguin, a winged humanoid, or a hippocampus? The plot detail of a character from the sea having difficulty maintaining their true form the longer they stayed disguised on land had a lot of interesting potential to be extended to other characters, either to the mermaids if their journey takes them from the sea to the human world, and this could be a way of raising the stakes of their story by adding a kind of suspenseful ticking clock element, or even to the villains, which could be a really cool way to reveal some traitor character in disguise, or even to be alluded to with Kaito being a Panthalassa, like in the scene that parallels him being injured at the surf meet, he has to take a break, and in the long convalescence period he spends on dry land out of the ocean, he starts exhibiting Panthalassa traits that he has difficulty controlling. Also, if Nikura knew about Hippo's human form before Lucia, Hanon, and Rina did, what is the full extent of her awareness of Hippo's true nature before the reveal about him being Hippocampus comes later on? If Hippocampus is the divine beast protector of the sealed gate, then as someone who's in charge of guarding what Akaregina has brought forth when she used her power to imprison the Panthalassa clan, as she herself told him to do, he should be treated with way more importance than just being Lucia's chaperone. I'm not opposed to Hippo's motivation for protecting the girls being to atone for his failure to do what Aqua Regina instructed him to do by not guarding the steel gate, but having him sleeping on duty isn't the way to do it. What does Hippo napping on the job and allowing Sarah to free Gakto have to do with why he disguises himself as a penguin? Is he trying to hide from Aqua Regina or something? How did Sarah even obtain the key to free Gakto to begin with? To be honest, the Pro Radar plot device that got squandered so badly is probably better off being repurposed to finding the key so that Hippo can use it to unlock his true power, since he can transform into his hippocampus form with it and use it as a rod when in his human form. I've been trying to think of hopefully non-convoluted ways to connect Hippo with the pure villains just by virtue of them both having wings. So maybe Mikiru or the Great One or whomever does something that creates a disturbance that overpowers Hippo while he's doing his guard duty despite his efforts to stop what's going on. Mr. Amagi did extensive research on the Panthalassa clan in the past, so it'd be an interesting piece of foreshadowing to have him cause this disturbance during his research that creates a perfect storm which allows Hippo to be out of commission and Sarah to free Gakto, which is then brought back up again in the context of these new villains, which would be a great way to reveal that Rihito and Mikaru are descendants of Panthalassa. All that being said, considering the mythological hippocampus is supposed to be the mount of the gods, I do think it's strange that Hippo here has been given a comparatively sedentary task instead by protecting the steel gate. Also, does Yuri even know about Hippo's penguin form? Now, moving on to Kaito. Kaito really just makes me mad. Other than the fact that I don't like the relationship between him and Lucia because of his rudeness and her immaturity, he was written in such a way that leaves a lot of character growth at a deadlock, which basically comes down to him being born with special powers because he's one of the Panthalassa clan, but the story doesn't give him permission to use his powers in a meaningful way. After the first arc, where Kaito learns he's a Panthalassa, Kaito goes back to Hawaii to compete in a serving competition because he wants to test his own abilities, after which he's attacked by Mikiru on the beach and loses his memories, and there's barely enough time between Kaito getting his memories back and Mikaru taken in by Mikiru before Kaito goes into a downward spiral of guilt and either can't or won't help the mermaids with his powers during their hour of need. However, this problem runs so much deeper than that. Kaito learns that his parents, who perished in a shipwreck as a child, aren't his biological parents and he was adopted as a baby after he washed up on the beach after a storm, which puts him in a dark state of mind. Especially since both of his parents were famous musicians and a lot of people know about him through association with their legacy, the revelation that he's not their real son is even more painful to him. On top of that, a lot of weird things have been happening to him lately that he's trying to protect Lucia from by distancing himself from her, and his parents confirmed to him in their letter from beyond the grave that he has these special powers, which he already has a little bit of awareness of from the spontaneous headaches he gets whenever Lucia is in danger, and being able to understand dolphin speak. With all this emotional turmoil, he tries to figure out who he is and makes progress in that area. But then Gakto shows up and reveals that Kaito is his younger twin brother, which on paper would give Kaito closure since he found someone from his real family and understands why he has these strange powers. Except Kaito rejects Gakto and even outright tells him that he doesn't know or care about what the Panthalassa clan have endured across their history. Now, granted, Gakto has done some terrible things, and Kaito isn't completely oblivious to this information, so it's understandable that Kaito wouldn't want to associate himself with someone like Gakto, but given the severity of Kaito's depression up until this point, it feels incredibly strange that he would make a recovery from that so quickly, and is now so confident in who he is that he's willing to throw out anything that doesn't align with this image. So the creators have basically written Kaito into this corner where he isn't given enough opportunities to use his powers, but even if he did have those opportunities, it still wouldn't work because it would be out of character for him to acknowledge his Panthalassa roots so earnestly, which feels incredibly self-defeating and pointless. Looking back over the notes I made in preparation for this video, I get the feeling that a lot of the creative choices made for this story were decided on out of convenience. The main characters are mermaids, so there doesn't have to be an origin story explaining how they got their powers. Kaito is a Panthalassa, so Lucia can have a get out of dying if I tell the boy how I love free card because guess what? He's not a human, so everything's hunky-dory. This ties into a larger issue that I tend to have with the shoujo romance magical girl genre. Of course, not every story has this problem, but happens often enough for me to notice it, which is that the male love interest feels like their only main purpose is to be a prize in order to give the main heroine something to strive for over the course of the romance plot. Was that one quote from Mr. Potato Head in Toy Story 3? You're an accessory! A purse with legs! Yeah, that's what these male shoujo leads feel like sometimes. And with Kaito Domoto, this is painfully apparent. Other areas where I feel like Kaito deserved to be written better. The fact that Kaito's first trip to Hawaii is treated as a big pinch point in his relationship with Lucia makes me so upset. First, it promotes a really unhealthy dynamic between the two of them, where she doesn't want him to leave, to the point where she's not even there to help her friends fight the Black Beauty sisters and discover the truth about the seal key. On top of that, Kaito is receiving a lot of blame for not being there to protect Lucia after he left to Hawaii to grow and develop as a person, and Gakto is trying to use this as evidence that Kaito doesn't care about her, yet one can make the argument that Lucia, Hanon, and Rina themselves are doing the very same things Kaito is being accused of because they left their countries to go to the surface and all they're doing is goofing off until the villains decide to make their move. Is it really that insignificant that Kaito announcing his Hawaii plans to Lucia was part of his love confession to her? This ignores the fact that Kaito has a strong personal motivation for leaving in the first place, because he realizes that surfing helps him remember who he is through the surfboard his father gave him that helped him not be afraid of the sea after the shipwreck. When I read this part of the manga again where he meets Lucia in his dream and tells her about the surfboard, I went down this long rabbit hole trying to untangle this plot hole that flew over my head before. Kaito's been afraid of the ocean ever since the shipwreck, but was able to gradually get more comfortable with the ocean through the surfboard his father gave him, even though the shipwreck was what took the lives of Kaito's parents? Did Kaito's parents buy a surfboard for their 7 or even younger-year-old kid that Kaito decided to start using regularly after his parents passed away? How did they come to the conclusion that surfing was something their young child wanted to do when they were primarily a musical family and not so much into sports? I'm so confused. Anyway, on top of Kaito's personality needing an adjustment so that it would actually make sense for him to purposefully use his Panthalassa power more often, we don't know very much about what other kind of power Kaito was able to exhibit that makes Gakto interested in him other than just being his other half, or how the girls can use Kaito's power to their advantage. Especially because right after the final battle with Gakto, which itself is right after Kaito learns he has power to begin with, he loses his memory to seal that power away and protect Lucia, so once again we don't see this check the story wrote being cashed in any meaningful way. According to Gakto, he has the power to control the seas, so he definitely could have put that to good use. Also, Kaito being referred to as a prince after Gakto's defeat, even though Gakto was the king of the deep sea, but now that Gakto isn't here anymore, does that mean that Kaito is the new king of the deep sea? As if this wasn't confusing enough, Sarah tells Lucia that Kaito has the blood of the king of the sea, so there's no possibility that he lost his life in the sea's embrace. Everything we've heard about Panthalassa up until now is that they control a dark power and are cursed and have been sealed away by Aqua Regina for tens of thousands of years in order to protect the peace of the seas, but now they're being protected by the sea? Is this part of Gakto's redemption or something? If the king of the seas is a Panthalassa, then what does that say about the goddess Aqua Regina? Is one a consort to the other? Is the king of Panthalassa supposed to rule via divine right under Aqua Regina, but then tens of thousands of years later there was a schism that brought them to be cursed? Why are the descendants of Panthalassa being held responsible for the crimes committed by one person tens of thousands of years ago? Maybe, in an alternate version of the story, Kaito's learning how to accept and use his power given to him, with both he and Lucia displaying an act of heroism when Mikeru first shows up and steals the fragments of Seida's heart, only for Kaito to be seriously injured in the process. As he recovers from his wounds, he still tries to practice his powers, but this time on a much smaller scale so as not to aggravate the injuries he already has. But later on, once he's fully healed, he's unable to use his powers to save Mikeru despite his efforts to do so, after which he questions his worth and usefulness. Overall, I feel really weird about Kaito, because on the one hand, I think he's a jerk, but on the other hand, I seriously feel like he got done dirty by the story, so I'm in this ambivalent zone where I'm simultaneously calling out and defending this guy. Alright, I complained a lot about Kaito, so it's only fair that I talk about Gakto next, and this will also include my thoughts about the Dark Lovers and the Panthalassa clan as a whole. It's pretty clear to see that Kaito and Gakto are supposed to be written as if they're parallels to each other, The two of them are both lonely, Gakto because his clan has been sealed away in the deep sea for thousands of years, Kaito because he's an orphan, a feeling that's later exacerbated when he finds out that he was adopted, and both are willing to do anything for the one they love. Gakto is fulfilling his promise to Sarah to offer up the oceans for her, even though he knows that she still has her eyes on Taro. Kaito wants to protect Lucia. We don't know anything about 𝚖𝚒𝚒𝚎 apart from the fact that this is the clan that Kaito and Gakto belong to and the prehistoric race from which Rihito and Mikado are descended through their mother. So some additional backstory on 𝚖𝚒𝚒𝚎 is very much appreciated, since they're made out to be such a big deal in the story. What was its society like? What is it about this clan that makes Gakto so determined to revive it? What's at stake for the main characters that the clan is revived, other than just having it be at the expense of the mermaids' countries and Aqua Regina due to Gakto's villainous motives? Why does Gakto believe that the restoration of 𝚖𝚒𝚒𝚎's power can only come at the defeat of Aqua Regina? Gakto tells Kaito that when the two of them were separated, Gakto was raised alone as the king of the deep sea, but he also says he was completely alone. Who is rearing this child? Kaito washed up on the beach when he was 2 years old, so his twin brother had to find out what happened to him through somebody, since he's too young to remember firsthand what went on. How does he know that the life Kaito got is better than what he's dealing with? For all he knows, Kaito could have suffered misfortune after being cast to the currents and might never have made it to the surface at all. How does he know that the shipwreck killed Kaito's parents? For a little kid who's been sealed away at the bottom of the ocean, he sure is on top of events across the sea and on the land. Aqua Regina mentioned in Volume 2 that she sealed Gakto away to the bottom of the sea when he and his minions threatened a piece of the world, but then in Volume 4, Gakto says that the Steel Gate Key has kept the 𝚖𝚒𝚒𝚎 clan sealed away for tens of thousands of years. Which is it? Are the 𝚖𝚒𝚒𝚎 clan just inherently evil and were sealed away thousands of years ago, and then later on Gakto was up to no good and Aqua Regina had to use up all of her power to defeat him? Later on, when Gakto reveals himself to Kaito, he says that his family was sealed away at the bottom of the sea out of fear that they would become great again. Again, what was it that Kaito and Gakto's ancestors did tens of thousands of years ago that warranted them being sealed away in the deep ocean forever? Did Aqua Regina herself split apart Pangea or something in order to stop them? Are the rest of Kaito and Gakto's family still alive, or is it just the two of them? How is it that Rihito and Mikado's mother is a descendant of 𝚖𝚒𝚒𝚎 if the only members of the clan that we know of that have gone to the surface are Kaito and Gakto? What was the deciding factor in having Kaito being sent away and not Gakto? If Kaito was sent to the currents, why haven't more people of 𝚖𝚒𝚒𝚎 tried to resort to such desperate measures to give themselves or their children a better future than being sealed away? Is this what happened with Mrs. Amagi? Is this something the people of 𝚖𝚒𝚒𝚎 did themselves, which would undermine Aqua Regina's power even further? Or did Aqua Regina herself do this? If so, why? Who else had access to the key of the sealed gate in order to facilitate Kaito being shipped off to the human world? Were Gakto and Kaito really the only multiple offspring produced by the same pregnancy, or however weird supernatural sea creatures reproduce, over the course of tens of thousands of years? Does that mean Mrs. Amagi, or one of her ancestors, is a twin too, and she got sent off like Kaito did, which is how she was able to meet Mr. Amagi? If the 𝚖𝚒𝚒𝚎 clan is cursed with not having many descendants, which is why Mikado and her mother were so sickly, then why does Kaito have such powerful ability to recover from wounds and illnesses? I need to move on to something else now, because the more I try to read these plot twists about the 𝚖𝚒𝚎 clan, the less sense they make. As far as ideas about how Gakto could be rewritten, we know he wants to take over the Seven Seas and make Aqua Regina his own, but we don't get a sense of what he intends to do after he succeeds in his goal. After he takes all the princesses, steals their pearls, and does all this terrible stuff, what does he plan to do moving forward? If we actually had an idea of what Gakto was going to do now that he has taken control of the seas and the entire world, then it would make him seem much more threatening. Furthermore, he and Sarah were both crushed by fate and despair, which made him truly love her. But we don't see enough scenes of the two of them being loving towards each other to justify this or see what good the other has brought in their lives despite them doing awful things. Gakto mentioning that in the deep sea he's an all-powerful prince gives me an impression that his power is dominant once he has taken this empty barren land in the deep sea for himself, as opposed to conquering and colonizing already inhabited land, which is kind of sad. Since he's been shut in the deep sea, I don't think it makes sense for him to be traveling to the surface, so he has agents work on his behalf to be his eyes and ears and allow him to attack remotely. But to emphasize his loneliness, he actually doesn't have any henchmen at all. It's similar to the plot twist about the 𝚢𝚘𝚎 being sea animals that Gakto transformed with this magic, and they in the castle were all illusions. This could be taken a step further by having his minions only being shadows of himself created by his magic to really emphasize the reality that he's working alone. However, in his self-centeredness, he refuses to believe that his minions, the mermaids he's captured, etc., aren't there of their own free will because they finally recognize how great he is and their attention is treating the wound his loneliness and jealousy towards Kaito has inflicted upon him. Also, when Gakto steals Kaito's power, his own castle can't withstand the amount of power being thrown around, but by Gakto's own admission, the castle itself was a mirage, so why doesn't he use his power to make the castle even more imposing? Considering the main trio had come to Gakto's castle before, it would make things more interesting by having the castle now be different and perhaps more liminal and surreal, with the castle's reality itself shifting as a symptom of Gakto's volatile levels of power, rather than having the mermaids just go through the same routes over again to try and free Coco and Noelle, with the main danger being the castle collapsing. Either way, Gakto's apathy about what happens to the castle would remain unchanged. Despite me giving Kaito flack for rebuking his brother, I do feel like there's potential in Kaito's development learning who he is, serving as a teaching moment for Gakto. Gakto already has his sights set on obtaining Kaito's power and not giving Kaito a choice about how he'll use that power, but because Gakto is completely alone, he's probably never experienced being rejected by anyone before now. Not the Dark Lovers, not Sarah, no one. So having him lash out to this rejection in another way could really show just how far Gakto has fallen in his tunnel vision quest to fulfill his promise to Sarah. When Kaito awakens from the spell Gakto put him under and vows to protect Lucia, things have the potential to get even more exciting and dangerous since Gakto has been rejected again, only this time he now has more power that he knows what to do with, so he's basically a bull in a china shop and can do so much more damage here than when Kaito retaliated for the first time. Furthermore, considering everything Gakto's done to fulfill his promise to Sarah only for her to turn to the good side, regain her powers, and stand against him when Aqua Regina's revived, one would think he'd be the most angry at her, even more so compared to Kaito. So it feels strange that he directed attack towards Lucia specifically, or he could even take on and subjugate Aqua Regina now that she's shown up. In the end, I imagine Kaito being an instrument in Gakto's redemption, then Kaito's change of heart facilitates Sarah's redemption, which then leads to Noelle and Coco being freed from a plot device I'll describe later on. Unlike Sarah, I don't think it's necessary for Gakto to be a redeemed just to die character, especially because he still appears in the second arc in spirit form and is tasked to watch over the princesses, presumably by Aqua Regina, so we don't entirely feel his absence. Plus, having his clan be cursed to loneliness for tens of thousands of years, then for Gakto to start a revolution only to be sealed away again feels so self-defeating. I get that the story is playing up the tragedy of these moments, but having the mermaids redeem the villains and allow them to continue living to free them from their loneliness, and Kaito's as well for that matter, since now he's been reunited with a biological family member for the first time in his entire life, communicates the message of the story so much better, which is about friendship, love, and overcoming fate. So, in the scenario I've come up with, Gakto survives but loses all his power, which is an outcome he's happy with since he even said in the manga his body had limits to the amount of power he could wield at once. His new mission is to rebuild the legacy of darkness and hate the 𝚢𝚒𝚒 clan has been stewing in for so long, and transform it into the love and hope for the future that our heroes are championing for. This way, with Gakto surviving and turning over a new leaf, we see him victorious over the fate of the 𝚢𝚒𝚒 clan and making a positive impact in the world after feeling the warmth of hope for the first time, even after losing all of the illusions he created in his loneliness. Combined with a scene from the manga later on in the second arc, where Gakto takes over Rihito's body and gives Kaito a dressing down by telling him to use himself to make amends, taking the punishment for his crime and going through the pain to make that crime right again, and proving that he's a 𝚢𝚒𝚒 prince to rescue and protect the ones he loves, seems to apply just as much to Gakto as it does to Kaito in that moment. You know, a totally normal conversation to have with your brother. To me, this feels like what Gakto would have done himself in canon if he hadn't been sealed away and now he wants Kaito to succeed where he failed. On a more self-indulgent note, I just think it'd be really sweet to have scenes with Gakto having a domestic life on land with Lucia, Kaito, and the crew, especially now that the two brothers have been reunited and can work on rebuilding their bond. Of course, Gakto would have more interactions with the Yamagi family in this setting, and I want to imagine him and Mikado eventually becoming a couple, with Mikado no longer being lonely anymore, with her only friend being her pet bird that she literally named Happiness, and her relationship with someone that's from the same race she's descended from, and Gakto being able to find a genuine love outside of his doomed relationship with Sarah that consumed him to the end, since he himself said that he'd still be alone if he gained the world but lost her heart. By the way, I do have alternate ideas for the Suiyo that don't have to involve them being figments of Gakto's imagination. For context, I thought it was confusing that the Dark Lovers are obviously threatened by having the mermaids in their castle since they want Gakto all to themselves and don't want other women around, but they're still following his orders to capture the mermaids, which leads me to believe that they're only after the pearls and couldn't care less about the girls. With that in mind, it'd be funny to see a wide range of reactions from the 𝚢𝚘𝚎 towards the mermaids, with some being hostile, some being ambivalent, and at least one, in all likelihood Yuri since she falls in love with Hippo, not having a problem with the mermaids at all as people, but at the end of the day just wanting their pearls. Next, let's talk about 𝚖𝚊𝚒𝚒 and Mimi. What are my thoughts on 𝚖𝚊𝚒 and Mimi? They should have been brought back in season 2. Next question. No, but seriously, their existence is very confusing in the context of the original manga. First of all, I don't like their team name. When working at the Pearl Baths, Lucia and Nikora are already known as the Beauty Sisters, so having this new villain group called the Black Beauty Sisters implies that there's supposed to be some kind of connection there. It's weird. Furthermore, the Black Beauty Sisters were the only ones who thought to ask Gakto if he could give them 2 of the 7 seas if he were to gather the other pearls. Which begs the question, what's in it for the rest of the 𝚢𝚘𝚎 if he wins, since they've obviously never made such a request to him? Are they just motivated by their love for him? Why did Mikeru choose 𝚖𝚒𝚒 and Mimi of all the 𝚢𝚘𝚎 to be given back their human forms with this power? What advantage does he think those 2 will give them? The fact that they also use music attacks just like him in his own winged underlings, maybe? Why revive them exactly as they are and not give them some visual distinctions of their own to show that they're under his command? Especially because there are several land and marine animals with wings in his own castle. What did the Black Beauty Sisters plan to do after they've tricked the wing group by taking over their paradise once it's been revived? Considering they want 2 of the 7 seas as a reward from Gakto, what is fueling their motive for this common desire of takeover? I understand that the reason why they came back in the story is because they were the only one of the villains who knew the girls' secret identities and they tried to use that as leverage to manipulate Fuku and Mikeru into giving them what they want, but it still feels flimsy since their discovery of the princess's identities just kind of fell into their laps and didn't require any effort on their part, so there's nothing preventing the winged enemies from being able to accomplish the same thing. Also, I don't buy their reconciliation with Mikeru because unlike the Dark Lovers, they weren't simping for Gakto and doing everything for his favor, so the 2 of them saying that Lady Bat, Lanhua, and Alala felt for Mikeru but the 2 of them felt for Gakto doesn't hold up. If it were up to me, I would limit 𝚖𝚒𝚒 and Mimi to only being relevant in the first arc and have them specifically be Sarah's henchmen while the Dark Lovers are Gakto's. I would even take this a step further and actually have them be corrupted versions of Noelle and Coco, which would make the setup and payoff about Sarah working with Gakto be even more interesting. First, because the Black Beauty Sisters are initially presented as being unique characters who use the power of the Mermaid's Pearl set in their mics, since our heroes are being defeated by the power of their fellow princesses, only for one of the main villains to be the Orange Princess herself, and the main characters knowing they need to free Noelle and Coco from the spell in order to unite all the princesses, not knowing that Sarah, one of the princesses, was also partially responsible for having them end up like this in the first place. I'm having fun picking apart these villains, so next let's talk about Mikeru and his unnamed winged posse. If you watched my previous video about Tokyo Mimi Olive Mode, then you might remember me going on a tangent about how I feel like the liturgical theme with the St. Rose Crusaders felt kind of tacked on without being explored too much, and that definitely still applies to this group of villains. In fact, I think this is even more egregious in Mermaid Melody's case because it's another aspect of this part of the story which reinforces the idea that it's pretty much a scrape of Sailor Moon-esque. Now, I absolutely hate it when people try to claim that any Magical Girl series released after 1993 is inherently a ripoff of Sailor Moon, but even I have to admit that Mermaid Melody is trying so blatantly to copy Sailor Moon-esque's homework, it's bananas. In light of everything I just said, it might be an awkward moment to bring up this unpopular opinion, but I don't hate the second arc of Mermaid Melody as much as the rest of the fandom does, and I think it has to do with the fact that the villains feel like more of a threat since they're targeting the humans instead of mermaid countries, since the main characters are on land and not in the sea. However, Mikeru and his flunkies are still a hot mess, plus the world building is as bad and confusing as ever, and if I try to make sense of it for more than 5 seconds, my head will explode. Mikeru says Lucia doesn't understand the truth of this world, and neither does the audience because we don't know anything about this prehistoric race, what its people were like, and what role mermaids had to play in it. So Mikeru's situation is the polar opposite of Gakto's in many ways. Gakto was completely alone, while Mikeru is part of an ancient race. The Pantalasa clan was cursed and sealed away in the deep sea, while Mikeru and his race belonged to a higher echelon of diverse supernatural beings, but the planet changed its environment in order to accommodate for humans, who then became the more dominant species. Interestingly, we see the motives of the villains change throughout the course of this arc. At first, they want the mermaids to join them in bringing forth their plans, but then later on, after the mermaids repeatedly turn them down and battle them, the Great One gives up on the princesses aiding them and now view them as their enemies. Yet for the most part, we don't see any change in their actions towards the mermaids. Having them act really diplomatic towards the mermaids at first, all the while having cruel intentions towards the humans Dolores Umbridge style, only for the mask to fall off when the mermaids keep foiling their plans, thus directing their aggression towards the mermaids directly instead of just reserving it for the humans, would have increased the stakes of this arc, especially since Mikuru says to Karen later on that hatred is the basis of all things and generates the greatest energy, which could provide a hint to his motivation. There's so much that I could say about Mikuru and how I think he could be written better, but honestly I think most of it boils down to some variant of trimming the fat of what his motivation is because it's too convoluted and his plan requires too many oddly specific steps in order for him to achieve it. Honestly, Mikuru is probably my favorite character in all of Mermaid Melody. He goes through a lot of ups and downs over the course of the story, so it was really easy for me to form an emotional connection with him and want to know what happened to him. Which is to say that I think other than the world building problems with the ancient race he's trying to revive, I feel like he met a lot of his potential as a character and he just needs some tightening up. Plus, I've made it no secret that I have a weakness for long-haired pretty boys in anime, so what's not for me to like? Also, the Great One, aka Tahito and Mikaru's dad, is known as a great creator, but all he seems to do is revive past beings that already existed, so he doesn't seem to be capable of making new things. Depending on how you look at Alala, where she's clearly a new creation from the Great One, but later on, after Mikuru takes Mikaru into his body, Alala mentions that she knows where and why she and the other two servants of Mikuru were brought back to life, which is how Mikuru learned that he himself is a creation of the Great One by xeroxing DNA with a fossil. Since I brought up Alala, she introduces some interesting concepts about these villains. When she's first created, she's initially a kind of blank slate with no clothing or even a face, but then Fuku allows her to transform into a yukata using a fragment of 𝚬𝚐𝚎's heart that Mikuru gave to him, which she loses after she's been beaten by the mermaids, and all of her subsequent appearances show her in her Tinkerbell dress. Obviously, a fragment of 𝚬𝚐𝚎's heart gets added to the pearl whenever the mermaids defeat an enemy, but other than a scene later on where Lady Bat eats one of these fragments, we don't really see how the fragments are able to augment their powers. Based on the aforementioned scene with Alala's outfit change, the villains could receive a different variant compared to their normal selves versus when they've been granted the power of a mermaid pearl fragment. Later on, after he succeeds in taking Mikaru and 𝚬𝚐 inside of him, Mikaru has such an ego that he'll attack his underlings for expressing concern about his perceived haste in moving forward with his plans, and not allowing his and Mikaru's bodies to become one because they're concerned they might not be able to protect him due to how strong the mermaids are. Which is perfectly reasonable, and his reaction wasn't. After Mikuru calls his underlings trash made from trash, they call him out on it, understandably angered that they did their best to do what he requested of them, and doing an Uno reverse card on him by saying that he was the one who created them and asking what he is, saying they know a truth that Mikuru is aware of, which is where and why they were brought back to life, which clearly disturbs both Mikuru and Fuku and sends Mikuru down to the basement of his castle where he sees the fossil he was created from. What I find interesting about this whole series of events is that Lady Bat is the only one who doesn't join in on calling up Mikuru. It was actually the first one to bring up these concerns to Mikuru in the first place, which makes sense given how later on she says that Mikuru was the one she really looked up to. But apart from the scene where she shows up at Hito's mansion, we don't really see a lot of her being especially loyal and devoted to Mikuru compared to the other enemies. In contrast, Alala seems to be the most annoyed with Mikuru, Lanhua is probably more neutral, and Alala even outright tells Mikuru that he really made her angry, but she gave them their dream in the first place since they were all created and not born like he was. Is part of the reason why she was so seemingly frustrated with Mikuru because of that dream he gave her and also treating her and the others with coldness? Like he was playing hot and cold with her or something? The fact that Mikuru has such a hostile reaction and says that he's nothing like his underlings seems to imply that they're also copies like Mikuru is. And we as the audience, just like Mikuru, we don't know where and why the underlings were brought back to life because we never got any elaboration on Alala's statement. By the way, I wrote out this whole long tangent in my bullet points while I was reading the manga about how I thought it was really interesting and cool that the only way for Sarah to be born in these circumstances was for something absolutely terrible to happen. Mikuru lost his influence over 𝚬𝚐 because, as Fuku himself said, once the real Mikuru awoke, then the copy of Mikuru and the fragments would disappear completely, so with Mikuru gone, the fragments of her heart would unite into one. But then I realized I remembered that scene entirely wrong. Kaito destroyed the fossil, Mikuru set 𝚬𝚐 free, and Fuku snapped and subjugated Mikuru to carry out his purpose directly in place of the destroyed fossil. I'm gonna say it, I think the version of events that I misremembered was better. It gives the main characters a choice to allow something catastrophic to occur in order for their main goal to be realized. Now that I think about it, why exactly is the structural integrity of Mikaru's castle contingent with whether or not the fossil has been destroyed? Is this Follow the House of Usher but with evil angelic boy failures? Last but not least, we need to talk about the Amagi family. Starting with Hibihito, his daddy issues don't make any sense. From the beginning, we get the idea that Mr. Amagi exploited Mikaru and didn't truly care for her, but this is information that both the audience and Hito have before it's revealed that Dai Professor Tomoe experimented on Mikaru. So what is Hito's understanding of how his father screwed over Mikaru before he finds out about the deal he made with Fuku, where he started giving her fake medicine in order to prepare her body into a vessel for Mikaru? Is this a case of the authors accidentally tipping their hand at plot details that haven't been revealed yet? Let's be honest, that's exactly what happened. Or is there more to the situation that we don't know about? Is making the Great One a bad father in every aspect really the best way to write his character? Suppose he genuinely cared about and advocated for his daughter and was a positive figure in her life, and he believes experimenting on her is the right thing to do, which makes the action all the more insidious since we have to accept his bad traits with his good traits. Also, when Mikaru is having her breakdown after Kaito returns home, how does Hito intend to fight his father if he's completely absent in his children's lives and is presumed dead at this point in the story? Seriously, Hito knew where to find a hidden key in a picture frame that he used to open a chest kept in the basement of his house, yet is surprised to find Gakuto's rod inside, yet he doesn't know what that is? Is Hito just mad because his father isn't around? Mikaru herself said that if it wasn't for her, then Hito could play in foreign venues. So even though he is willing to be her caretaker and is protective about her, could there possibly be a hint of resentment towards his father for leaving him in a parental role over his younger siblings since they don't have their mother anymore? Considering Mikaru is reincarnated as a baby at the end, it just feels like such a slap in Rihito's face to keep him trapped in the cycle of parentification. Plus, if Rihito's Panthalassa power comes forth through his music, then is his success at his career based on any talents he may have? Or is he just using magic to get this acclaim? Poor guy. I can't tell if the great power of Panthalassa being a curse that didn't allow them to have many descendants contradicts the fact that Kaito and Gakuto were twins, or that makes the appearance of the twins even more dire. How did Mrs. Amagi find out she was a Panthalassa? How much research did Mr. Amagi do independently about Panthalassa versus what he examined from his wife? Are there still some things about Panthalassa that remain mysterious or unknown to him? If the fossil of this superior race was found in the South Pole, then could that information be relevant to Karen's country in any way? How and when did Mr. Amagi first encounter Fuku? What qualities of both Panthalassa and Mikuru's race does Mr. Amagi hope to manifest with this brand new race? Why is Mr. Amagi known as the Great One if humans are so reprehensible in the eyes of the Winged Ones, who are superior to them and have existed for much longer than them? If Hito and Mikaru are half Panthalassa through their mother, then statistically how many other Panthalassa are there through Mrs. Amagi's family tree? This really takes the wind out of Kaito and Gakuto's sails. I wish I had more personal opinions to offer about how to fix the men of the Amagi family, but honestly they're such a wreck that I'm kind of at a loss for words. Fortunately, I do have more original ideas about Mikaru, so let's end things off with her. Another unpopular opinion, but I don't hate Mikaru. Like I said, I'm not a fan of the romance between Lucia and Kaito, so that probably has something to do with it. A little bit of background before I talk about Mikaru. It's really weird to me how the mermaids don't have any friends who aren't fellow mermaids. They stick close to each other, and any relationships they have with humans are limited to the boys they have crushes on. I thought it would be really interesting to have the main trio be part of a friend group with humans, and it could add a fun dynamic to the cast where you can see them all getting along and having a good time, but our heroines are trying to keep their identity secret from them, and the humans feel like there's something off about the mermaids but can't put their finger as to what that is. This is where Mikaru comes in. Maybe she's just trying to do her best to tend to Kaito after he was found by her, and she and Lucia become friends who bond over the fact that they both care about Kaito and want to help him. Considering how alone Mikaru was, there's the possibility of that manifesting into her being anxious, socially awkward, and overall afraid of people outside of her brother and father, and learning how to trust others. which Lucia could help her do since she seems so friendly and knows Kaito and how to take care of him. I'm not entirely sure what happens to Kaito in this hypothetical rewrite, but I would personally avoid having him lose his memories. There are so many reasons why this plot device doesn't make sense. Not only does this solve a problem a lot of media has where too many female characters don't have female friends and just see other women as rivals, but it would also make the twist later on with Mikado more tragic because we've grown to care about her along with Lucia and she's not being treated as trying to take Kaito away from her. While she doesn't start out clingy and possessive, she could still turn that way in response to Lucia's suspicious behavior as she tries to keep her secret from both Mikado and Kaito, plus her being occupied with her mission in fighting Mikeru and his underlings and finding the fragments of Seida's heart, which Mikado interprets as Lucia being a bad person who has something to hide, from Kaito and believes that she, this be Mikado, is the best person for Kaito because of that. Given Mikado's emotional state when Mikeru approaches her, she would probably be really upset with Mikeru for extending such an offer to her, even if he's promising to release her from all of her pain, because at this point she feels like she has nothing to offer anyone and is just a burden who is better off having never existed. If Mikeru instead approached her with a promise to make her more than who she currently is, then that might be a more effective way of reaching her since she's so full of self-loathing, which would make the idea of her and Kaito being tied together in the same body forever even more enticing to her, since by her being something different than she already is, she feels like someone who is more deserving and worthy of Kaito just because she's not who she once was anymore. Which is really sad now that I'm writing this down. I do think Mikado got a nice mini redemption at the end of the story, as in the scene where Rihito was paying his respects to his parents, she's playing with a friend, so she's overcome her loneliness, and the friend remarks on how cute the teddy bear she has is, to which Mikado jokingly says that she can't have it. Then Rihito tells Mikado it's time to go, Mikado gives the bear to the friend, showing that she's also outgrown her possessiveness. All of that begs the question, would any of that change once Rihito tells Mikado the truth about what happened? So, those were just some of my many different thoughts about the story of Mermaid Melody. Not gonna lie, this video was a huge challenge for me to make. Besides the miracle that was my computer not exploding while recording this massive speed paint, it was actually pretty nerve-wracking to go through the process of turning my bullet points from rereading the manga into a semi-coherent script, but I hope you found a little enjoyment in hearing my fragmented commentary regardless. Are there any points I didn't bring up in my analysis that you think I should have? Do you agree or disagree with any of my takes? I've been staring at my nose for so long that I don't even know if it turned out good in the end, so at the very least I hope you enjoyed this speed paint. Regardless of how you feel about this video, it's time for me to shut it down. Make sure to give Boba Cat some pats, snacks, and playtime before you log out, and head to the description of this video to find links for every other corner of cyberspace I'm on. Thanks for letting me chat with you, and until next time, Ankoru wa ikaga?